Welcome back. I hope you all had a refreshing lunch and some good conversations during the break. Now that we are re energized, let's get ready to dive into the next session of our conference. Now is the time for an online session on learners' autonomy. I would like to call Dr. Sia Gore ma'am to chair this session, who is professor in HOD Department of Pathology. Ma'am, kindly introduce the speaker, ma'am.
So, very good afternoon to everyone. So, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anshu, Director Professor in Department of Pathology at Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Medical Sciences, Sevagram. Dr. Anshu holds an MD Pathology and Masters of Health Professions Education from Maastricht University. She has served as a Southeast Asia representative for the board of directors of the Network Towards Unity of Health and is actively involved with FAMER in various leadership and mentorship roles across the globe. Her contributions to medical education are extensive, with over 60 peer-reviewed publications and 30 book chapters, as well as co-editing the book Principles of Assessment in Medical Education. Dr. Anshu has also been recognized with multiple prestigious fellowships, including the Commonwealth Academic Staff Fellowship, CMCL FAMER, and the International Fellowship in Medical Education. And we are honored to have her here today to share her insights. So I welcome Dr. Anshu for the talk.
Thank you, ma'am. Am I audible and are my slides visible?
Yes.
Is my voice clear?
Yes, madam, you're audible.
So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back after lunch. Today, let me start by thanking the organizing team for inviting me to speak here. So I'm sorry I couldn't be in Pune, but I think I'll make it up by this talk, which is given online. So I'm going to talk about learner autonomy and how our roles as medical faculty have changed in the post-pandemic era. What would you say about the student? The student was labeled difficult by his teachers. He dropped out of school just after a few months. He had almost no formal education. In today's system, we might probably write him off. And this student here was actually Thomas Alva Edison. Edison was self educated. He barely went to school for a few months. He, as you all know, was a prolific inventor. He developed devices such as the phonograph, the early versions of the electric bulb, and the motion picture camera. He had more than 1,000 US patents in his name and in other countries as well. And he established the world's first industrial research laboratory. So, after all this, and we know many more people like this, do you still think that formal teaching is essential? So, what do we learn from Edison's story? He did not follow the curriculum, he created his own learning path. He asked questions that had no answers in textbooks, and he learned by doing, failing, and then trying again. What he had was learner autonomy. So, what exactly is learner autonomy? It is defined as the ability to take charge of one's own learning. And the basic principles behind them, the first principle is that of constructivism. When you say constructivism, you mean that learners actively construct knowledge based on experience and reflection. Knowledge is not something which is passively received, but actively built. And the key ideas to remember here are that learning doesn't happen when you tell somebody something to do, when you passively give a lecture. That is not when learning happens. Learning happens when the learner interacts with the content and actively builds his understanding of um, his own knowledge, his own experience, all of it added together. So learning happens in a context, and learning is experiential. So what we need to remember is that learning is not about giving answers, but about helping students build their own understanding. The second theory on which learning autonomy is built is the self determination theory. Now, when we are all born as children, one thing is common, that we all are curious. As babies, you can see how curious they are, how excited they are about handling everything, learning everything. What happens in our environment? How do we kill the human spirit? And we all know of children and of adults who, instead of being proactive and engaged, can be passive and alienated. So, what happens with their experience? What happens with their environment? What happens in their whole learning journey, which turns them from active, engaged learners to passive and alienated learners? So, there is this beautiful paper by Ryan and Desi who say that motivation thrives when three needs are met. And these three needs are, the first is autonomy, which is a sense of control over learning. When you feel that you have a control over learning. Second is competence. When you feel that I can do something, when you feel capable of doing something, and you feel you have the skills to do something. And the third component is ratedness. You have seen in COVID that even though people were students were online, they had access to all information, they did not enjoy learning because they lost their connection with peers and teachers. So the learning environment is important, where people learn from each other. They should feel that they are able to do something. That feeling of being capable of doing something is important. And the third is feeling control over your sense of learning. So remember that when autonomy is supported, students don't feel passive and alienated. They don't feel disengaged. They lean in and they want to learn more. They feel engaged and active. So to summarize this, the key aspects of learner autonomy are that they are able to decide what their own goals are. They are able to regulate their resources and time. They are able to reflect, and that is what we call as metacognition, know whether I'm doing well, whether I'm not doing well, do I need to change something? And there is an inherent motivation to learn, which does not is not the same as somebody encouraging you from outside. It is something which is internal. So to emphasize this further, in autonomy, the onus of learning shifts from the teacher to the learner. The learner is responsible for their own teaching. The decision making also stays with the learner, where they make informed choices about how to learn, when to learn, and what to learn. Great component of autonomy is self regulation, where you know what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, how much time will need to learn something, how do I plan it, how do I monitor my uh, learning, whether I've learned enough or whether I not need to do something else to learn, and a genuine, real self assessment where you know how much you know. You don't need to cheat yourself. So, learner awareness or metacognition is knowing how you know and knowing how you learn best. And again, the control of learning, the locus of control is not outside with the teacher. The locus of control is internal, which means there is an internal motivation, an intrinsic motivation to learn. So these are the components of autonomy. And do they sound very familiar to you? I'm sure they would, because in this morning, Dr. Praveen Iyer talked to you about self directed learning, and he defined it um, as Malcolm Knowles would have said, as a process in which individuals take initiative with or without the help of others in diagnosing their own learning needs, formulating goals, identifying human and material resources for learning, and choosing, implementing appropriate learning strategies and evaluating learning outcomes. So remember that SDL or self directed learning is the operational core of learner autonomy. It is the how of how to implement autonomy is SDL. So the basic principles here are active inquiry. You allow the learner to make meaning of what they are learning. by experience, by allowing them to be curious, allowing them to handle things. That is important. It is important to manage learner resources and time and allow them to evaluate their own progress. So I'm going back to what Praveen mentioned in the morning, which is the levels of self-directed learners, which Gerard Groh has talked about. And he said that the path to becoming a self-directed learner starts from the bottom, where you are a dependent learner, where you rely on an instructor. There is no self-direction and it's task-oriented. From there, gradually, you learn to become an interested learner, where you will still seek some opportunities, you set some goals, you're trying to build your confidence, but you're not always self directed. An involved learner is able to recognize learning needs, he's able to learn by self. And set learning goals and plan action to achieve those goals. And you have already seen the definition of a self directed learner, where all these tasks are done by themselves. They're intrinsically motivated, they assess their own achievements, and they know how to search for valid and reliable resources. Now, for each of these individuals, depending upon their level or their stage of SDL, your teaching style will have to change. So if your learner is a dependent learner, maybe they were in school where it was all of it was spoon feeding. In that case, what you will need to do is behave like an authority or a coach. Your style of teaching is coaching, giving immediate feedback, giving direct answers, maybe giving them an informational lecture. But as they move to the second step of being an interested learner, you will change your approach. You will be more of a motivator and a guide. You will help them with setting goals and developing their learning strategies. And here you'll probably have a guided discussion instead of just a directive lecture, a didactic lecture. The third stage of being an involved learner is where you are more of a facilitator and the discussion is facilitated by a teacher as an equal. You allow them to give self-directed seminars, student-led seminars, allow them to do group projects. And a self-directed learner means you do not need to be there as a teacher. You are more of a consultant and a delegator. When a student comes to you for help, then you give help. And this is what we do more of in as a dissertation guide or more in internship. So basically, if you look at this chart, what you are doing is what Gerard Groh and Vygotsky called fading. So fading essentially means you gradually withdraw the support you're giving and allow the student to become a self-directed learner. So in other words, at the bottom, it is focused instruction. You give them an instruction and they will say, yes, I will do it. And in the green belt where there is the interested learner, you will say, you will give some guided instruction and they will say, yes, we will do it together. Collaborative learning where the teacher and the student do it together, and independent is that you do it yourself. So what are the challenges in the Indian context to implementing learner autonomy? There are systematic barriers where if you look at our school system, it's changing now, thankfully. But when we were students, it was where a lot of it was spoon fed. So a lecture to expect a student to come from that background and suddenly become a self-directed learner is somewhat hard for them. The second thing which happens is that they come from vernacular medium. Um, they've been learning in their own languages, and suddenly all our textbooks here are printed in posh English, and they're coming from the West. So to understand that language, it builds a huge divide. The second divide, of course, is digital inequity, where you presume that they know how to handle technology. So there is a divide here happening both in terms of the language and in terms of the digital inequity. And this is a barrier to implementing autonomy. The third is the anxiety with which assessment creates. On the one hand, you are talking about learner autonomy. On the other hand, your assessment demands rote learning. So irrespective of what you do, students are going to learn to the test. Students learn what we inspect. And so, irrespective of how much gyan you give them about being self-directed learners or put them into projects to do something, if your assessment doesn't change, what they're going to do is still go back to rote learning. So, What is important is in assessment, you give them choices or assess them the same way that you expect them to learn. So you can have open book examinations. You can have you don't have to have a summative examination at the end of it. I remember as a learner in Maastricht University, it was my best learning experience. There was no final examination. I was asked to complete 10 units, and each of these units was being marked all the time. And none of this asked me to go and mug up something. I was given project works, I was given things to think about, produce, reproduce, read on my own. And each of these assignments was total, the marks of it were total. And that complete total was my final assessment. So it was learning as assessment. There was no separate assessment in the end to see whether you've learned at the end. I was being assessed throughout the course. So that kind of thing, if you expect learner autonomy, you give the learner the freedom to learn the way they want. My course was with me, my curriculum was with me, and I knew what tasks had to be completed. Now, whether I did it using AI, whether I did it using a textbook, whether I did it by asking somebody, or whether I did it by using any course is immaterial. I used the methods which I was most comfortable with. And then I produced the tangible outcome which the teacher was looking for. So that itself was an assessment in itself. I couldn't copy from anybody. There was a plagiarism check everywhere. And this reduces the assessment anxiety here because you're being judged the way you expect to learn. The last challenge and the biggest challenge of all is the faculty who feel very uncomfortable with losing control. I remember 20 years ago, I joined I was just learning about medical education, and gradually, is it 20 years ago or 15 years ago, whatever. So I used my first project, and in that, what I did was I asked my students to have group discussions where they would themselves in the group discuss. And I used a fishbowl model where teachers would sit in the back and listen and intervene when required. Now, my faculty got so upset with me, and I got a public humiliation for this, for saying that, हम क्या कर रहे हैं यहाँ बैठ के? वो अपने आप पढ़ रहे हैं, तो are we needed at all? So that lack of control which teachers feel is very hard to deal with. It's important that you trust not only students, but you trust yourselves. And only then you'll be able to give them, the learner, the true autonomy that you require. But thankfully, the winds are changing, and there have been three catalysts which have propelled the wagon of learner autonomy ahead. The first, good or bad, is COVID. It's given us so much of unstructured time that everybody has been learning something on their own, whether it's cooking, whether it's online courses, whether it's AI. Everybody has become a self directed learner, and you have to thank the pandemic for it. The second, of course, in 2009 was that CABME was ruled out, and even though we are not given the freedom to do what we want, there have been certain things which have been good with CBME. And there is this philosophy of self directed learning which is coming. There are electives which give you the freedom to choose what learner wants, even though it is a bit restricted. And the beautiful thing about early clinical exposure. So, all of this are important. And the push from the national education policy, which is talking about flexibility, critical thinking, and holistic learning. So these are the things which have propelled or pushed, given the right push towards learner autonomy. In the morning, I think Praveen has already talked about the different strategies for implementation from our paper in Indian pediatrics, where you can all use these simple tools, whether it's flipped classrooms, whether it's reflective portfolios, whether it's case-based or problem-based learning, group projects, reciprocal teaching, electives. Remember, all of this is simple. We don't need any fancy technology for this. What we need is the freedom to experiment, the flexibility to experiment, and not too many directed, structured, rigid regulations from the top. So give people the freedom to be what they want to be. You have given us the competencies to be achieved. How we achieve it is our responsibility as medical students and teachers. I don't think there should be interference from the regulatory bodies about how we should do, how many hours to do. That freedom should be given to every institution to do things best within their resources. And I think everybody will be glad to innovate.
5
So
minutes.
in Singapore, where I come from, we have allowed students to go into the community, and this is where your village adoption scheme is coming from. Um, they can go into the villages and see actually how sanitation or cleanliness happens. And there is more than one way to teach well, pun intended.
Five
So,
more, madam. Sorry to
yes,
interrupt. Sorry to interrupt, but 5 minutes more.
right. I'll try to finish. So the faculty's role in supporting autonomy is changing. You can move from being an expert or a facilitator to being a mentor. What you can do is to provide choice. And the choice, not only in allowing students to do things the way they want to, choice you can also give in assessment, where you give people that to achieve the same aim, there are different kinds of questions. I remember I did a course in leadership, and they gave me three different scenarios. Whatever scenario suited you best, you write it in that way. So that kind of choice is there. Always encourage curiosity. It's something that every student comes with. And the moment you are not student friendly, you kill that curiosity. So we don't want you to give answers. You ask your questions and people will be happy. Celebrate reflection. Don't just celebrate recall or rote memory. So we need to be ready to be not just the content master, but are you ready to be the coach? So how do you design support? Remember, autonomy doesn't mean is not the same as neglecting students. अपने आप, पढ़ना है अपने आप पढ़ लो. No, it is structured support. And there are three aspects of it. The first is scaffolding. And this term scaffolding comes from Lev Vygotsky's theory of zone of proximal development. Now, in the zone of proximal development, he talks about three zones. The inside zone is the too easy zone, where the student can do the task without help. The outside zone is the too hard zone, which is beyond the student's abilities. But there is a zone in between, which Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. This is the potential for learning which we need to explore. This zone is what the student can do well if he is supported by what he called MKO, which is more knowledgeable other. So if a learned person, if a person who knows supports a student, he can be pushed from this central zone to the zone of proximal development. Proximal meaning this is close to what he does know, and therefore he can achieve this. So I am struggling to learn yoga every morning, and every day my instructor tells me try a little more. That extra push that is given there, so from not being able to bend to at least touching my feet in Surya Namaskar is what I have done because somebody supported me. So that is what you mean by scaffolding. The second principle of what is required by teachers is constructive feedback. And as your students keep increasing from batches of 100 to 200, you are going more and more distant from them. And with that, NMC's regulation of saying minimal faculty will not be able to give you constructive feedback. It's something you need to remember. For quality, you will require more faculty. And then the freedom to be flexible, to be able to do what you want. Every institution, every teacher, every student needs that flexibility. And as long as you don't demolish these rigid structures of bureaucracy, you will not achieve it. So remember, autonomy is not about leaving students alone. It is about empowering them to learn effectively with our support. I would like to bring you back to this wonderful story that we learned in childhood, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. How many of you remember this story? So Goldilocks was an impetuous girl who wouldn't listen to her parents. And in one fit of anger, she decided to do what she wanted to do. And she walked into the forest. And she walked into what was the home of Papa Bear, Mama Bear, and Baby Bear. And on the table, on the dining table, she found three bowls of soup. And she tried the first big bowl of soup. And she said, "This is too hot for me." She tried the second bowl of soup and she said, "It's too cold for me." And she tried the little bear's bowl of soup and she said, "This is just right for me." So remember, every learner knows what is just right for them. And in words of Gerard Grow, to teach well, we must meet students where they are, not where we want them to be. And Gerard Grow, in his stage SDL model, talks about aligning teaching style to the learner readiness in these four beautiful pictures which he has drawn himself. The first is stage one, where this learner is absolutely raw, where you are spoon feeding or rather pouring your knowledge into his brain. The second stage is where he's like malleable clay, and you are trying to shape that malleable clay and create something beautiful out of it. The stage three is where you are a guide helping somebody to climb that mountain. And stage four is where you allow your plants, your beautiful saplings to grow on their own. You don't interfere too much. Sunshine does its work, the nature does its work. What you're doing is simply nurturing them. And eventually, this is the concept of fading, where your involvement in the learner is gradually receding and you allow them to do things on their own. So, this brings us to the question: is autonomy for everybody, for every student? No, this is not true. It is not for every student, and many students need help transitioning. So for that, you must use Grove's model to gradually shift responsibility. And this is a beautiful picture which shows, depending upon the learner, your style of teaching will have to change. This diagonal in the center shows it's a perfect match. Now, if the student is a self-directed learner, and if you are going to give a lecture, like an expert here, the student is going to get really bored. On the other hand, if the learner is a dependent learner and what you're going to do is leave them free, they're going to struggle. So these two red blocks are severe mismatches. And as the yellows become paler and paler, you go from a severe mismatch to a mismatch to a near match, and then this is a perfect match. So you will have to explore with this. Usually you teach to the average learner, but there will be times when some people in your class will feel bored and you will have to keep experimenting. We have talked about this already, that autonomy assumes access, but this is creating a digital divide. So always check that if your students have devices, internet, and language fluency. So the solution is, whenever you design a class, do the offline first design. And if this does not work, then you can use the online. Use group work. People struggle with languages, so
Madam,
multilingual.
it's
I'm just
time.
finishing two more slides. Yeah, just finishing quickly. So, and then you have mentoring. So let's not make autonomy a privilege of the elite. And what if you still want to be stubborn and don't change? What is going to happen is that the students will disengage. You're already seeing it. People don't attend your classes because they will become passive graduates, and CBME will remain on paper. So we don't want to do that. We want to empower thinking, reflecting, and creating adaptive learners. So what is important here is that to enhance learner autonomy, we will need to we require to create a system-wide alignment and intentional actions all levels of the stakeholder. So at the level of the regulatory bodies, don't just talk about autonomy, embed it in policy, in curriculum and assessment norms, fund innovation, uh, um, allow people to be flexible and recognize that kind of innovation. Universities need to have flexible credit hours, recognize non-traditional ways of teaching. Medical colleges, whatever you do, do it with an underlying philosophy of SDL. Train your faculty. The faculty I've already talked about. Scaffold learning, shift from being a content deliverer to facilitation, and learners themselves will need to have to take ownership of their learning. So where do we begin? Stop asking, are our students ready for autonomy? And start asking, are we ready to support their journey towards it? Autonomy is not the end of teaching. It is the start of transformational education. So I'm going to end with three things that I wanted you to take away from this session. The first is that do not assume autonomy. Autonomy must always be scaffolded. That support is needed. And when you need to do that, use Gerard Grove's model, which helps you to match teaching to student readiness. And of last, do not feel insecure. We are not replacing teachers. We are reimagining their role. I started with Edison and let's end with another famous scientist with great wisdom who said, Albert Einstein, who said, wisdom is not a product of schooling, but of the lifelong attempt to acquire it. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, madam, for making this concept very clear with various examples and addressing different challenges and role of faculty in this particular aspect. So if there are any questions,